the writer of Silver Prairie. Episode 1. The Teacher from the East. A stagecoach rolled slowly across the open plains. Dust followed the wheels like a long gray cloud. Inside the coach sat Emma Harper, a young woman. She held a small suitcase and looked out at the endless grassland. She had come a long way to become the new school teacher in a small town. Called Silver Prairie, Emma had never seen a place like this before. No tall buildings, no busy streets, only wooden houses, a few stores, and a wide road covered in dust. When the stagecoach stopped, the driver jumped down. "Silver Prairie!" he called. Emma stepped onto the street. At that moment, loud shouting came from the far end of town. A steer broke loose from a small herd and ran wildly down the street. People jumped aside. Emma froze in the middle of the road. The animal was big, with long horns and wild eyes. She had never been so close to a cow before. Then a rider suddenly galloped out from behind the saloon. The cowboy rode straight toward the animal. His horse moved quickly and calmly. In one smooth motion, the cowboy threw a rope. The loop fell over the steer's horns. The horse turned sharply. The rope pulled tight. The steer stopped. The street fell silent. Emma stared in shock. Before anyone could say anything, a little girl ran forward. "Don't hurt Daisy!" she cried. She wrapped her arms around the steer's neck. Emma blinked in confusion. This is Daisy?" she asked. The girl nodded proudly. "My pet." People around them began to laugh softly. Emma felt her face grow warm. The cowboy loosened the rope and tipped his hat. He had calm gray eyes and a quiet voice. "Name's Caleb Ryder," he said. Emma quickly picked up her suitcase. "I didn't ask," she replied. She turned and walked toward the boarding house without looking back. Caleb watched her go. The stagecoach driver chuckled. "Careful, Ryder," he said. "That schoolteacher looks tougher than most cowboys." Caleb smiled a little. Across the street, a tall man standing near the saloon door watched the scene. His name was Duke Callahan, and he was already thinking about how useful this quiet little town might become. Far out on the prairie, the wind moved slowly through the tall grass. Silver Prairie looked peaceful, but trouble had already begun to arrive. Episode 2. The Man from the Trail. Morning came quietly to Silver Prairie. The sun rose over the wide prairie, and the town slowly woke up. Emma Harper stood inside the small schoolhouse. She opened the windows and let the cool air come in. Outside, a few horses were tied near the store. Dust moved slowly across the street. Soon the children began to arrive. Some walked. Some rode small horses. A few came barefoot. Emma smiled as they filled the room. The schoolhouse was simple, but the children were eager to learn. That morning passed peacefully. But near noon, the sound of a fast horse broke the quiet. A rider came down the street at full speed. People stepped out of the store and the saloon to watch. The rider stopped in front of the water trough and climbed down. He was tall and lean, with sunburned skin and a wide grin. Across the street, Caleb Ryder looked up from the hitching post. For a moment he stared. Then he walked forward. "Luke," he said. The rider laughed. "Caleb Ryder, I thought that was you." The two men shook hands like old friends. "I haven't seen you in 3 years," Caleb said. "Been a long trail," Luke replied. Some of the men from the saloon came closer. "Friend of yours?" one asked. "Rode the cattle trails with me," Caleb said. "Name's Luke Fallon." Luke nodded to the men and walked with Caleb toward the saloon. At the schoolhouse window, Emma watched them. "Who is that man?" she asked one of the older girls. "That's Luke Fallon," the girl said. "People say he used to ride with Caleb." Emma watched as the two men disappeared into the saloon. She was about to close the window when she noticed something else. Another man stood in the shade near the saloon door. Tall, still, watching. It was Duke Callahan. Luke stepped inside the saloon. Callahan's eyes followed him. For a brief moment, the two men looked at each other. Then Callahan smiled. Outside, the prairie wind moved through the town again. Emma slowly closed the window. She did not know it yet. But Luke Fallon's return was about to change everything in Silver Prairie. Episode 3. Dangerous Company. Life in Silver Prairie slowly settled into a routine. Each morning, Emma Harper taught the children in the small schoolhouse. The room was simple, but the students were eager to learn. Some could barely read. Some had never owned a book. Emma worked patiently with them all. One afternoon, a boy named Tommy stayed after class. "My pa might be late today," he said. "Why?" Emma asked. "He went to the saloon," the boy replied quietly. Emma did not like the sound of that. Across town, Caleb Ryder rode into the dusty street and tied his horse outside the saloon. Through the open door, he saw Luke Fallon sitting at a table. Duke Callahan sat across from him. They were laughing and drinking together. Caleb stepped inside. "Luke," he said. Luke looked up. "Caleb, sit down." Caleb did not move. "You're keeping the wrong company," he said calmly. Luke leaned back in his chair. "You worry too much." Caleb glanced at Callahan. The man smiled but said nothing. Caleb turned and walked out. In the weeks that followed, trouble began to spread across the valley. One rancher lost several cattle. Then another reported the same thing. Soon, everyone in Silver Prairie was talking about it. Rustlers! Someone was stealing cattle from the nearby ranches. The town grew uneasy. One evening, the saloon was crowded. Voices were loud, and the air smelled of smoke and whiskey. Tommy's father stood near the bar, arguing with two men. "They were my cattle!" he shouted. One of the men laughed. "Prove it." The second man pushed him hard. Tommy's father stumbled back against a table. At that moment, the saloon door opened. Caleb Ryder stepped inside. He saw the men shove Tommy's father again. Caleb walked forward slowly. "That's enough," he said. One of the men turned. "And who's going to stop us?" Caleb did not raise his voice. "I am." The man swung his fist. Caleb moved quickly. In a moment, the man was on the floor. The second man backed away. No one else in the saloon moved. Caleb helped Tommy's father to his feet. "You all right?" he asked. The man nodded. Across the street, Emma had stopped outside the schoolhouse. She had heard the noise and seen the door of the saloon swing open. Now Caleb walked out and stepped into the fading light. For the first time, Emma looked at him differently. He had not started the fight. He had ended it. But Emma still remembered the hard laws of the West, and she was not sure she could ever trust a man who lived by them. Far away on the dark prairie, unseen riders moved through the night. More cattle were about to disappear. Episode 4, The Brand in the Canyon. A few days later, Caleb Ryder rode alone across the open range. The wind moved slowly through the tall grass. The prairie looked quiet, but Caleb's mind was not at ease. Too many cattle had gone missing. Too many strange riders had been seen near the valley. That morning, Caleb noticed fresh tracks near a dry creek. Several horses had passed through not long before. Caleb followed the tracks across the prairie. They led toward a narrow canyon hidden among low hills. As Caleb rode closer, he slowed his horse and listened. From inside the canyon, he heard the sound of cattle. Then he heard something else, the sharp hiss of a hot iron. Caleb rode quietly to the edge of the rocks and looked down. Several riders stood in the canyon below. A small herd of cattle was gathered near a fire. One man held a long iron in the flames. Another man pushed a frightened calf toward him. The iron came out of the fire glowing red. The man pressed it against the calf's side. The animal cried out. A new brand burned into its skin. Caleb's face hardened. These cattle did not belong to those men. They were stolen. Rustlers! Then Caleb looked closer at the man holding the iron. His heart sank. It was Luke Fallon. For a moment, Caleb said nothing. The fire crackled. The cattle moved nervously. Finally, Caleb rode down into the canyon. The riders turned quickly. Hands moved toward their guns. Then Luke saw who it was. "Easy," Luke said. The men stepped back. Caleb stopped his horse a few yards away. He looked at the burning iron in Luke's hand. Neither man spoke for a moment. The wind moved softly through the canyon. At last, Caleb spoke. "Luke," he said quietly, "this is your last chance." Luke did not answer. Caleb's voice stayed calm. "Turn around and walk away from this." The firelight flickered across Luke's face. For a long moment, he stared at the ground. Then he slowly set the iron back into the fire. But he did not step away. Caleb understood the answer. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode out of the canyon. Behind him, the fire burned, and the iron grew red again. Episode 5, An Answer. Life in Silver Prairie was not as peaceful as Emma Harper once believed. Each week, new rumors spread through the town. More cattle had disappeared from the valley. More riders were seen moving across the prairie at night. Many families had begun to worry. Some men now kept rifles beside their beds. Doors were locked earlier in the evening. Emma slowly began to understand that life in the West was different from the quiet towns she had known before. One afternoon, she finished class and walked outside the schoolhouse. Across the street, Caleb Ryder was tying his horse. He had just returned from the range. His clothes were dusty and his hat was pulled low against the sun. Emma hesitated for a moment, then walked toward him. "You've been busy," she said. Caleb nodded. "Work never ends out here." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Caleb rested his arm on the saddle. "I'm leaving tomorrow," he said. Emma looked at him. "Leaving?" "Long cattle drive," Caleb replied. "We're taking a herd south to Colorado." Emma had heard about cattle drives. Men rode for weeks across open land, sleeping under the sky and watching the herd day and night. It was hard and dangerous work. "When will you come back?" she asked. "Maybe 2 months," Caleb said. The wind moved dust across the street. Caleb looked at her quietly. "There's something I want to ask you," he said. Emma waited. Caleb spoke slowly. "When I come back, I want to know something." Emma felt her heart beat faster. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb met her eyes. "Will you be part of my future?" The words hung in the warm afternoon air. Emma did not answer. She looked down at the dusty street. After a moment, Caleb nodded slightly. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to answer today." He climbed onto his horse. "I'll ask again when I return." Caleb tipped his hat and rode slowly down the street. Emma watched him until he disappeared beyond the buildings. The prairie wind moved softly around her. She had not given him an answer, but his question stayed with her long after he was gone. Episode 6, The Stampede. For many days, Caleb Ryder and his men drove the cattle south across the open prairie. The herd was large. Hundreds of animals moved slowly across the land. During the day, the sun burned hot above them. At night, the riders took turns watching the herd. Most nights were quiet. But one night, everything changed. The sky was dark and the wind was rising. Caleb rode slowly around the herd while the cattle rested. Some men slept near the small campfire. Others sat on their horses watching the shadows. Suddenly, a loud noise broke the silence. A gunshot, then another. The cattle lifted their heads. For a moment, everything was still. Then the herd exploded into motion. The animals began to run. Hundreds of hooves thundered across the prairie. The ground shook. "Stampede!" someone shouted. Caleb spurred his horse forward. "Ride, turn them!" he yelled. The cowboys rushed into the darkness, trying to control the running herd. But the cattle were wild with fear. They crashed through the grass and dust, running blindly across the land. The night filled with shouting thunder and pounding hooves. For hours, the men chased the herd. Slowly, little by little, they managed to turn the animals. Near dawn, the running finally stopped. The cattle stood breathing hard in the gray morning light. The men gathered together again, tired and covered in dust. Caleb rode along the edge of the herd, counting. His face slowly grew serious. Too many cattle were missing. Nearly 200 animals had disappeared during the night. One of the riders shook his head. "Worst stampede I ever saw," he said. Caleb looked out across the prairie. In the distance, he could see faint tracks leading away into the hills. He studied them quietly. Then he spoke. "That stampede wasn't an accident." The other men looked at him. "Someone fired those shots," Caleb said. "Someone wanted the herd to run." He turned his horse toward the fading tracks. And in his mind, only one name came to him: Duke Callahan. Episode 7, The Posse. Several weeks later, Caleb Ryder finally returned to Silver Prairie. Dust covered his coat and hat. The long cattle drive had been hard, and the loss of so many animals weighed heavily on his mind. As he rode into town, people quickly gathered in the street. The news of the missing cattle had already spread through the valley. Ranchers were angry. Some had lost animals of their own. Others feared they would be next. That afternoon, many of the ranchers met outside the large barn near the edge of town. Among them stood Judge Walter Boone, the most respected ranch owner in the valley. Boone was an older man with a calm voice, but everyone listened when he spoke. "We can't let this continue," Boone said. "Someone is stealing cattle across this valley." The men nodded. "We need a posse," Boone continued. "A group of riders to track these rustlers and bring them back." One of the ranchers turned toward Caleb. "Ryder should lead it." Several others agreed at once. Caleb knew the land better than most men in the valley. He had tracked cattle across these plains for years. Boone looked at him. "Will you do it?" the judge asked. Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'll lead the posse." The men began preparing at once. Rifles were cleaned. Horses were saddled. Within hours, a group of determined riders stood ready. Their goal was simple: find the rustlers, bring them back. As the men mounted their horses, Caleb looked out across the wide prairie. The wind moved through the grass as the sun began to set. Somewhere out there rode the men who had stolen the cattle, but deep down, Caleb feared something else. He feared that when they finally found the rustlers, one of them might be Luke Fallon. Episode 8, Blood and Rope. For 2 days, Caleb Ryder and the posse followed the tracks across the prairie. The trail led north into rough country. Soon, the wide grassland gave way to broken hills and dry ravines. This was Badland country, a good place for rustlers to hide. Late on the second afternoon, one of the riders pointed ahead. "Smoke," he said. Thin gray smoke rose from behind a line of rocks. Caleb raised his hand. The posse stopped. "Move slow," he said quietly. The men spread out and rode forward through the rocks. When they reached the ridge, Caleb looked down into a narrow valley. Several riders were there. Stolen cattle stood nearby. One of the rustlers saw the posse first. He shouted a warning. Guns fired almost at once. The sound of shots echoed through the rocks. Caleb and the other riders fired back. The fight was short. One rustler fell beside the fire. 2 others dropped their guns and raised their hands. "It's over!" one of them shouted. The posse rode down into the valley. As the men tied the prisoners, Caleb noticed movement near the rocks. Someone was slipping away along a narrow path. Caleb spurred his horse and rode after him. The rider tried to climb through a gap between the rocks, but Caleb reached him first. "Stop right there," Caleb said. The man slowly turned. It was Luke Fallon. For a moment, neither man spoke. Luke looked tired and pale. "You caught me," he said quietly. Caleb kept his hand near his gun. Luke glanced back toward the valley. "They don't know I'm here," he said. He looked at Caleb again. "You could let me ride out of here." Caleb said nothing. Luke lowered his voice. "No one would ever know." The wind moved softly through the rocks. Caleb's face slowly hardened. "Turn around," he said. Luke closed his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. Caleb rode beside him as they returned to the valley. Behind them, the sun was sinking toward the distant prairie, and the long ride back to Silver Prairie had already begun. Episode 9, Judgment on the Prairie. Late the next afternoon, Caleb Ryder and the posse rode back into Silver Prairie. 3 prisoners rode in the middle of the group with their hands tied. Word spread quickly across town. People came out of the store, the blacksmith shop, and the saloon. Men stood in the dusty street watching the riders arrive. Everyone had heard about the stolen cattle. Everyone wanted to see the rustlers. The prisoners were pushed down from their horses. 2 of them kept their heads low. The third man slowly looked around the town. It was Luke Fallon. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some men were angry. Some were silent. Judge Walter Boone stepped forward from the porch of the general store. He studied the prisoners carefully. "These men were caught with stolen cattle," one of the ranchers said. "They were caught red-handed." Another man spoke loudly. "We all know what that means." The crowd grew louder. Several ranchers stepped forward. "There's no jail strong enough to hold them," one man said. "They'll escape before morning." Others agreed. "They need to hang." The decision spread quickly through the crowd. By sunset, it was clear what would happen. At dawn, the next morning, the whole town gathered near the edge of the prairie. A few tall trees stood there, their branches dark against the pale sky. Ropes hung from the branches. The 3 prisoners were brought forward. The morning air was cold and still. Caleb stood nearby with the other riders. He said nothing. Luke Fallon looked at him once. For a moment, their eyes met. They had ridden the cattle trails together. They had shared fires and long nights under the same stars. Now there was nothing left to say. The ropes were placed around their necks. The wind moved softly through the grass. Moments later, the horses were pulled away. When it was over, the crowd slowly began to leave. No one spoke much. Caleb remained standing long after the others were gone. An old friendship had ended beneath those trees. Later that morning, Emma Harper heard what had happened. One of the town women told her quietly outside the schoolhouse. Emma listened without speaking. She had known the West was dangerous, but this kind of justice felt cold and terrible to her. She walked slowly to the window of the schoolhouse. Outside, the town looked calm again, but Emma knew something had changed. Silver Prairie had its own laws, and those laws were written with rope. Episode 10, A Broken Heart. Not long after the hanging, Caleb Ryder rode out of Silver Prairie again. One man was still missing, Duke Callahan. He had escaped before the posse reached the rustlers' camp, and Caleb knew the outlaw would not stop stealing cattle, so Caleb followed the trail alone. For 2 days, he searched the hills and dry valleys north of town. Late on the second evening, he found fresh tracks near a narrow pass. Caleb followed them carefully through the rocks. Suddenly, a shot cracked across the canyon. The bullet struck Caleb in the back. He was thrown from his horse and hit the ground hard. High above him on the rocks stood Duke Callahan. The outlaw fired once more, then turned his horse and disappeared into the dark hills. Hours later, a ranch hand found Caleb lying beside the trail, barely alive. They carried him back to Silver Prairie and laid him in a small room at the Turner house. Emma Harper was the one who stayed with him. For many days, Caleb drifted in and out of fever. Sometimes he spoke without waking. Sometimes he whispered Luke's name. Emma sat beside the bed through long nights, changing bandages and bringing water. Slowly, Caleb began to recover. Weeks passed. Then months. During that time, Emma heard the full story of what had happened. She learned how Caleb had found Luke with the rustlers, how he had warned him, how he had been forced to bring his own friend back to town, and how he had stood there when the rope was pulled tight. One quiet evening, Caleb sat outside for the first time since the shooting. The sunset spread across the prairie in deep gold and red. Emma stood beside him. "You could leave this place," she said softly. Caleb looked out across the open land. "This is my home," he answered. Emma understood then. The West would always be part of him. But the West frightened her. Too many guns, too much anger, too many graves. A week later, Emma packed her suitcase. The stagecoach waited in the dusty street. Several townspeople came to say goodbye. Caleb stood a short distance away. Neither of them spoke much. When Emma climbed into the stagecoach, the old driver looked at her carefully. "You sure about this, miss?" he asked. Emma nodded slowly. "I think so." The driver studied her face for a moment. Then he gave a quiet chuckle. "You ain't leaving because you're scared," he said. Emma looked at him in surprise. The driver flicked the reins gently. "You're leaving," he continued, "because you love him." The stagecoach began to roll forward. Dust rose behind the wheels. Emma looked back once through the window. Caleb Ryder still stood in the street, watching the coach disappear into the wide prairie. Episode 11, The Last Threat. Weeks passed after Emma Harper left Silver Prairie. The town returned to its usual quiet rhythm. Children still came to the small schoolhouse each morning, though another woman now taught the class. Caleb Ryder spent most of his days out on the range. His wound had healed, but the scar still ached sometimes. In the evenings, he often rode slowly through town. The street looked the same as always, but something important was missing. One warm afternoon, a stagecoach rolled into Silver Prairie. Dust followed behind it as it stopped in front of the general store. The door opened. A woman stepped down. Several people in the street stopped and stared. It was Emma Harper. Caleb saw the stagecoach from across the street. For a moment, he thought he was mistaken. Then Emma turned toward him. They walked toward each other slowly. "I thought you went back east," Caleb said. "I tried," Emma replied. Caleb waited. Emma took a breath. "I realized something on the way," she said quietly. "What was that?" Emma looked directly at him. "I love you." For a moment, Caleb said nothing. Then he smiled slightly. The following days were filled with excitement in the small town. Word spread quickly. Emma Harper and Caleb Ryder were going to be married. People began making plans for the wedding. For the first time in many months, Silver Prairie felt peaceful again. But peace in the West never lasted long. Early one morning, a lone rider appeared on the road leading into town. The rider moved slowly through the dusty street. Men standing outside the saloon turned to look. They recognized him immediately. Duke Callahan. The outlaw stopped his horse in the center of the street. Caleb stepped out from the hitching post. The two men faced each other across the dust. Callahan smiled coldly. "So you're still alive," he said. Caleb said nothing. Callahan leaned forward in the saddle. "I'll make this simple," he said. "Leave Silver Prairie before sundown." The street had grown very quiet. Callahan's hand rested near his gun. "If you're still here after that," he continued, "I'll kill you." No one moved. Everyone in town understood what those words meant. There would be a gunfight, and only one man would walk away from it. Episode 12, The Rider of Silver Prairie. The sun was dropping toward the western hills. By late afternoon, the people of Silver Prairie had already gone inside their homes. Doors were closed. Windows were dark. Everyone knew what was coming. A gunfight. No one wanted to be standing in the street when it happened. The town was quiet. Dust moved slowly across the empty road. As the sky turned orange and gold, Caleb Ryder stepped out from the boardwalk and walked into the street. His boots moved slowly through the dust. The town felt strange without voices or movement. A loose paper rolled across the road in the wind. Caleb stopped near the middle of town. His hand rested close to his revolver. Somewhere nearby, Duke Callahan was waiting. The outlaw had promised Caleb would be dead before sundown. The sun slipped lower. Long shadows stretched across the ground. Caleb walked past the saloon and toward the far end of the street. Every sound seemed louder in the silence. Then a sudden noise broke the still air. A horse tied near the hitching rail jumped and pulled hard against its rope. The animal had seen something. Caleb turned slightly. At that same moment, a man stepped out from the shadow beside a building. Duke Callahan. His gun was already rising, but the startled horse had made him move too fast. His aim was not steady. Caleb moved first. His revolver cleared the holster in one smooth motion. A single shot cracked across the empty street. Then the town was silent again. Gun smoke drifted slowly in the evening air. Duke Callahan stood frozen for a moment. His revolver slipped from his hand. Then he fell forward into the dust. The fight was over. For a few seconds, no one moved. Then a door opened. Another followed. People slowly stepped out onto the boardwalks and looked down the street. The man who had brought fear to Silver Prairie was gone. The long trouble that had hung over the town was finally finished. That evening, the sky above the prairie burned deep gold and red. Outside town, Caleb saddled his horse. Emma Harper stood beside him. She looked once more at the quiet town behind them. Silver Prairie had become her home. Then she climbed into the saddle. Caleb mounted his horse beside her. For a moment, they both looked out across the wide prairie. The wind moved softly through the tall grass. At last, Caleb turned his horse toward the open land. Emma followed beside him. Together, they rode slowly across the prairie as the sun slipped below the horizon. Behind them, the town of Silver Prairie grew small in the fading light. Ahead of them lay a long road, a quiet home, and a life they would build together.